One of the least understood and maybe perhaps misunderstood topics in this course is that of evolution. But it's a very important concept, so I want to talk about, first of all, what that word means and what it doesn't mean to a biologist. So when you talk about evolution, really what you're talking about is a genetic change in a group of organisms over a period of time. So that's a particularly important definition that I'm going to come back to and talk about why that's important and what that means. Probably also heard of the word natural selection, and what the word natural selection means versus the word artificial selection is that both of them are the idea of what is the selecting force, what's deciding what genes or what characteristics are good or bad. And natural selection, nature is deciding, such as whether, if it's hot or cold or a lot of rain or not a lot of rain, if those affect certain survival rates of organisms, then that would be considered natural selection. We can also have artificial selection, which is basically where we decide what chemicals, for example, we might apply to a crop or that kind of thing. And then also important in this idea is what a species is, which turns out is actually kind of a hard word to define. But if we can think of a species as being a group of organisms that are capable of reproducing and making fertile offspring, you need this idea to really understand evolution, because it's really going to be a species in a particular area or a group of them that change over time. So a group of individuals in that species is what we call a population, and you need at least a population to really truly get evolution to occur. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. The idea of a gene pool, which is just basically all the genes or all the genetic material in a particular set of organisms, is considered the gene pool. And then we're also going to break down, talk about microevolution and macroevolution, the idea of getting small genetic changes over short periods of time, and macroevolution, same idea, but bigger changes over larger amounts of time. So talk about that. Many good studies have been done on evolution that have been used to demonstrate and sort of defend the theory of evolution. This is a famous one here recently with these guppies, and this particular scientist who's at UC Riverside was able to show a genetic change and a resulting change in a group of these guppies found in Trinidad over a relatively short period of time. So one thing people think is that in order to see an evolutionary event occur is that you need thousands of years, and no one's done that. But that's not true in this case. It's basically a 11-year ongoing study now, but able to show that by moving guppies from one location to another, you could see a change in the group of those organisms over a relatively short period of time. Just to give you some background very quickly on some people and some ideas before Charles Darwin, first we start with Plato and Aristotle. Plato basically believed that there were two worlds. There was a real world where everything was designed by some kind of creator and everything was perfect. And then there was a world in which we perceive things because our senses were not perfect. And that's why we would see things like an organism that maybe didn't look perfectly adapted to a natural environment. Aristotle believed, slightly differently, believed that things were created and could be placed sort of on this ladder, and it was called the scala naturae, in which everything could be placed on a ladder based on its complexity. And at that time, basically everything led to what was termed natural theology, which was basically studying nature to find out what God or the Creator's plan was. And that's kind of what biologists were like all the way up until and including Charles Darwin in the 1800s, when all of that started to change. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. Another person important to this discussion is this guy Carl Linnaeus. Carlos Linnaeus basically is the founder of a field called taxonomy, which is the science of naming and classifying organisms, and some of his ideas, even though he was a natural theologist, became important to Darwin later on. Also of significance, also a natural theologist, was Georges Cuvier, who was a French anatomist who discovered many different fossilized bones and believed that you could explain the presence and absence of these fossilized bones that were found in one area but not another due to events that he called catastrophism, which basically is a big catastrophe would occur and it would wipe out a particular bird, say, in a particular area, and you would no longer have that species in that area, but you would have fossils of it. Two other important, these guys are both actually geologists, Charles Lyell and James Hutton, helped describe what they called their theory of what they call gradualism. And as geologists, they basically were able to kind of defend the idea that you can get changes in the earth occurring over long, slow periods of time. In 1809, the year that Charles Darwin was actually born, the first bold move for publishing a theory on evolution was this guy John Baptiste Lamarck. And he published a theory basically based on the idea of use and disuse. It was a pretty good idea at the time, but it missed one fatal characteristic we'll talk about here in a second. But basically his idea was that you could pass on characteristics that you developed over your life. So for example, a giraffe trying to reach plants in really high, tall trees, if it stretched its neck a little bit each time, that over a period of many years, its ancestors, or its children basically, would gain the advantage. And we now know that that's not true, that you can't actually pass on characteristics you inherit, but instead that you could pass on genes. So his idea was bold at the time, but it turned out to be not correct. So in that same year, Charles Darwin was born in 1809. He was born to a family of doctors. His dad was a doctor, and his grandfather was a doctor. And so basically at that time, you were expected to be a doctor. So Charles Darwin was sent to medical school at a young age. And he did okay, but he basically, he dropped out of medical school. He didn't like it, even though he was passing. He was more interested in looking at birds and collecting insects and things like that sort. And so he studied natural theology and was basically, at the time, like other natural theologists, believed in the idea that there was a creator of some sort that made everything. And so after he finished his degree in natural theology, he took a job on the HMS Beagle, whose job it was going to be was to basically map the South America coastline. And in that, Charles Darwin, in that, collected some new species of Galapagos finches. At the time, did not realize that they were new species, but started to sort of put that together, started reading Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology and this idea of gradualism, and he wrote up this essay on evolution, but he didn't publish it. He knew kind of that this idea of evolution was not a popular idea, so he wrote it in the 1840s, but didn't publish it right away, kind of held on to it. And Alfred Wallace basically came up in 1858 with the same idea as Darwin, but ultimately Charles Darwin was given credit primarily in 1859 for writing up what is now known as The Origin of Species. It was presented actually as the work of Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin, but it turns out that Darwin's work was more thorough, according to the people publishing it, and it was sort of basically given credit. So even though you haven't heard of Alfred Wallace maybe before, he's another name that basically came up with the same essential idea independent. But Darwin's work was more thorough, had more examples. This shows you some of the Darwin's finches that we now know, the different species and how they came to be. And this is a particular one up here. But you notice there's a lot of variation in these finches. And so what I want to do is talk about what Charles Darwin's theory is now and why that's slightly different than what happened when he first originally published it. So the idea Charles Darwin had was that things could change over time. The problem is at the time, he did not really understand the genetic component. Genetics was being worked on by Gregor Mendel at the same time, but Gregor Mendel's work was not known to the scientific community, and so that at the time was not part of Darwin's original idea. That's been since modified to include that. So the idea basically with Charles Darwin's theory now is that with any group of organisms there's a high reproductive rate, which means that individuals could have lots of babies, let's say. Okay, so you have some rabbits, for example, and they could have a lot of babies. But if you look in nature, most of the time, except for a few cases of things like humans, populations remain constant. So that implies then that there's a struggle for survival. Okay, so not everything that is born survives in the animal world. So there's a struggle for that survival. The next thing is there's variation. You know, if you take any group of organisms and look at them carefully, there's always some variation. And that variation is often heritable, meaning you get genetic information from your parents. If you're a rabbit with long ears, you probably got long ears in part because your parents had long ears. So the idea there is that some genes are passed on better than others, and what ends up happening over time is you get a change in your gene pool, or you get a change in gene frequencies as a population changes. Now, just to show you one example where people often, if you have any doubts about evolution, a great example is this idea of evolution and drug resistance. Okay, so right now, I don't know if you know this or not, but there's several kinds of bacteria infections that you can get that 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago would not have been a problem to treat. And now some of these have become very, very deadly. And it's because of these bacteria evolving, like many other things, including cockroaches and rats and lots of other organisms that are good examples. But just to show you kind of how this works, let's say you have an infection. Okay, so in red up here you have a particular infection and you have these bacteria that have infected your body. So you take some kind of drug, you take an antibiotic, which works pretty well, and it wipes out and kills a good number of them. But some of them survive because there's always variation. Some of those individuals survive. What happens then is the next day, not feeling so good, you keep taking your antibiotic, but the ones that survived here probably had certain genetic differences that allowed them to survive and reproduce. Now you end up with more of those, and you notice you get less dying. And then by the third day, maybe you take that antibiotic and you notice that antibiotic is not working so well anymore, and all of these survive. Now normally what happens if you keep taking the antibiotic and the antibiotic's effective, you can put enough of a dent in the population that your own immune system can go in and handle that. But what has happened over many, many years is a lot of people take antibiotics for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, and they start feeling better, so they stop taking it. Well, what happens is the bacteria that survive reproduce. They have their own little babies, and what you end up with is this new strain. And over the years, people have changed and used different antibiotics and have over time made these very, very scary multi-drug resistant strains of bacteria for which we often have trouble treating. So if anything, if you ever have any doubts about whether evolution occurs or not, this is probably one of the best examples, most well-studied examples of really solid proof that evolution occurs and can affect your everyday life.